Hi. So, what's up, cognitive psychology class? Obviously, I wanted to have some time to cover a couple of other issues related to forgetting that I think are important to know for your test tomorrow. So, continuing in our vein of forgetting, I do want to talk a little bit about one of Sigmund Freud's lasting ideas from his theories and his work, and that's the issue of repression. So repression is a motivated type of forgetting where we are trying to block traumatic or threatening events from our conscious awareness, and we try to move those into our unconscious. Repression itself can be something that we consciously do, or it can be something that we unconsciously do. For example, probably one of the best known ideas about repression is this idea of infantile amnesia, which is basically the finding that prior to the age of 5, despite the fact that children are totally capable of remembering things and forming long-term memories, most of the time, if you ask an adult about their first memories, it will usually occur at about 4 to 5 months of age. And it was Freud's idea that what was happening was that traumatic events that occurred within young childhood and infancy ended up being repressed. Now, of course, that fails to get into the fact that apparently this is a phenomenon for most people. Does that mean that we all have traumatic events that we are trying to repress in our early childhood? And that I'm a little less likely to buy personally. Now, when we talk about motivated forgetting and repression, modern researchers often will examine survivors of abuse. And if you really want to take a look at one of the more, so we have a memory war over recovered memories in this particular case. So there are people who believe that recovered memories that people bring up in therapy or under the influence of things like hypnosis are not necessarily actual memories of abuse. There are other people that believe that if you have a period of your life that is very, very difficult for you to remember, you must have suffered something traumatic, and if you recover it, that must make it real. And it turns out that it's much, much more complicated than that. So when we talk about recovered memories, are they actually real or are they not? Are they a byproduct of somebody being incredibly imaginative? So one of the things that we can do to actually look at this is we can give people who have been survivors of abuse a DRM list. So like I showed you at the beginning of the memory unit, I give you a list of words that are all related to a particular word that I never say, like candy, soda, tart, but I never say the word sweet. And so for some people, they will falsely recall sweet when I never actually presented it to them. So if we give the DRM list to survivors of abuse, what's actually kind of interesting is that if you give them a false recognition test, like you see here, we have a few different groups of people. We have controls. We have people who have always remembered the abuse. There were people who were abused and they couldn't recall it. And then there are people who were abused and recovered memories. And it turns out that when you look at false recall from DRM lists, or in this case, false recognition, by and large, people who were abused and report having recovered memories of their abuse are far more likely to falsely recall the word from the list or recognize the word from the list that was never actually said. For whatever reason, they're more likely to report a false memory of a list item. Additionally, data from Leaf and Fekowich in 1995 suggests that 80%, and that's a pretty sizable proportion, of patients that reported recovered memories of abuse had a suggestion from a therapist that abuse was happening in this particular case. Now, one of the things that we know about being imaginative is that the more that you try to imagine something, it is entirely possible that your mind can make something real out of something that has been imagined. We especially see this with little kids. If you ask them to imagine an event that's never actually happened, like getting a finger caught in a mousetrap, and you ask them to imagine that story over a long period of time, like a few months, when you bring those kids back, they're going to believe that their finger was actually caught in a mousetrap. And when you tell them, no, you made that up, they're saying, well, why am I remembering it then? It must have happened. But it turns out that that's not entirely the case. The fact that we're so imaginative and open to suggestion potentially means that some of the memories that we have might not actually be 100% real. Here's something else that we do know. This is based off of research by Garrett's and and others in 2007. And what's kind of interesting is that if you look at the frequency of intrusions of unwanted events, what you'll generally tend to find is that for people who recovered memories in therapy, they don't really look all that different compared to controls or people who they looked at people who either recovered their memories in therapy, recovered them spontaneously, remembered them continuously, or controls who, so in continuous, they were never forgotten, and controls who were never abused in the first place. And what's actually kind of interesting is that the people who recovered their memories from therapy don't look like people who spontaneously recovered the event. In particular, spontaneous recovery, we tend to find that that tends to be more of positive events. But for people who are recovering memories of abuse in therapy, they don't really look any differently than people who are controls and people who never forgot in the first place. And that might provide us with some information about whether or not these are actually real or not. Now, really quick, before we move on to talk about amnesia, I do want to talk about going back to Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve and that notion of Jost's law, the idea that newer formed memories are more susceptible to loss, decay, and interference than older ones are. So why does the greatest amount of forgetting occur relatively early on? And part of the reason for this is because we do have a process that basically helps convert short-term memory into long-term memory as consolidation. And this is not just something that moves things into long-term memory. It's also about bringing information and storing it in the cortex in a permanent state. So this is a process that fixes information in long-term memory. It usually tends to take about several hours, and we know that the hippocampus is critical for those things, especially for those episodic memories. Generally, there are two phases of consolidation. Initially, everything is stored very rapidly in the hippocampus. Then over a period of several days or even up to years, that trace that has been stored in the hippocampus will eventually be transferred to the cerebral cortex. And this is especially true for our declarative memories, both our episodic and semantic ones. And this really fits with Jost's law, the idea that newer formed memories are more vulnerable. We do tend to find that brain injury is much more likely to impair newer memories than older ones. Here's some additional evidence that we have for consolidation. First of all, we do have the forgetting curve. The majority of memories tend to be lost within the first hour. We know that newer memories are more susceptible to retroactive interference and forgetting, but only for dissimilar materials. If you've ever drunken too much and you have a blackout, that's because alcohol is a depressant and it actually shuts down the hippocampus and creates a failure to consolidate. What's actually kind of interesting is that the memories that were formed before alcohol began to be consumed are better remembered. Additionally, if we put you into an fMRI scanner and ask you to recall different types of memories, we do know that newer memories tend to activate the hippocampus a little bit more. Older memories tend to activate the cortex. Okay, so let's briefly talk about amnesia. So If I had to ask you what you know about amnesia and you only used books, TV, and movies as your source, odds are pretty good it would not look like how researchers typically think of amnesia. Now, what is amnesia? It's a permanent impairment to some part of a memory system. Now, there are different means that amnesia can happen. It can even happen because of psychological stress, but we're generally only going to talk about the amnesia that results from brain injury of some kind. Now, let's be clear about what pop culture portrayals do. Generally, we tend to find that all memory is forgotten. You get a complete personality change. Maybe the problem is created with and cured by getting a bump on the head. If you've had me in other classes, you know how I feel about this one. Brain damage plus brain damage does not equal cure. Brain damage plus brain damage equals more brain damage, or it's caused by some sort of traumatic experience like we tend to see in a soap opera. Now, there are two main types that we're going to talk about. Retrograde amnesia is an inability to remember details learned prior to the amnesia. For most people that have some type of amnesia, there will be a little bit of retrograde. Usually the time before the incident can't be recovered. You won't remember the day before your brain injury or maybe a few hours before. Now, anterograde amnesia is different. This is when you're unable to form new memories, and in particular, we know about the research of HM. HM had his hippocampus damaged in surgery. He no longer had a bilateral hippocampus on either side of his brain, and because of that, after the surgery, he was not able to form new memories after his surgery. Any memories that he had formed prior to the surgery, though, were perfectly fine. So when you look at HM's brain, here's what he has. So you can see that there is a bilateral temporal lobectomy. You can see that those horns are missing. Here's where the hippocampus would normally be. This is what your brain kind of looks like. And here's a ventral view here. So interestingly enough, amnesia tends to affect declarative memories or explicit memories more than implicit memories. We do know that he was able to do the Tower of Hanoi puzzle, which you see here. So there are a bunch of different discs stacked onto each other, and the rules are that you can only move one disc onto a peg at a time. Your goal is to get all of this moved over to C, but you can only move one disc at a time, and you can't put a larger disc on top of a smaller disc. Now, interestingly enough, the more that HM did this, the better his performance got. He made fewer mistakes. He solved it more quickly. That's a procedural memory. It is implicit. On the other hand, if you asked him if he had ever actually seen this puzzle before, that's an episodic memory, and he would say no. But clearly, his behavior showed he was getting better every time he tried it. We also know he was able to form a layout of his home. So clearly, certain things are impaired with amnesia, other things are not. In general, amnesia is going to be much more detrimental to those episodic and semantic memories, certainly much more episodic than semantic. Procedural memory, skill learning, conditioning, those are all going to be considerably more intact. So you can remember explicit memory before the surgery, but you cannot form new explicit memories. So that's really all I had for this. If you have any questions about this or the study guide, feel free to email me before the exam, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.